Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I would like to continue talking about my current project of coding the combat system for a viewer's game. In particular, I'd like to talk about a new feature which the viewer whose game this is going to be has requested, and which I am going to code, have started to code, and I'm going to be coding over the next couple of videos as well, probably. And that is a stacking limit for enemies. So what is a stacking limit? Well, a stacking limit is a limit on the number of characters that can be in the same place at once. Why is it called a stacking limit? Well, that comes, I believe, from war games, from board war games, not computer war games. This was before there were computer games, really, where the units were represented by flat cardboard counters or chits. And when you had more than one unit in the same area, usually a hexagon, you would have to stack one on top of the other. And so a limit on how much you can do that is called a stacking limit. The limit that the viewer wanted is up to 3 hovering enemies and up to 3 non-hovering enemies in the same space at the same time. And the reason they want that is because of the visual display that we're going to have. If you have more than 3, it will be difficult to represent how many there are at a given distance. So with the player character and their companions, the player character can only have up to 2 companions, and the viewer is fine with them all being in the same space at the same time. So they didn't want me to code anything from that side. But for the enemies, there can be up to 15 enemies that you're fighting at a time. And the way that we've been doing it so far, we just put them all at distance 5 at the start. And that's not what they want. They want, let's say, the first 3 to go there, and then if we run out of sort of space, we put the next 3 in the next range band, and then if there's more, the next 3, and so on until we've assigned them all. I've done the code for the initial setup. In videos to come, I'll do the code for movement so that they won't move in a way that makes there be more than 3 hovering or 3 non-hovering in the same space. But as you can see, I have done the code for setting up the enemies with a limit of 3 per space. This is the beginning of a combat where we are fighting 6 enemies. Previously, they would have all been at distance 5, but now there's 3 at distance 5 and 3 at distance 4. If there were more than 6, there might be some at distance 3, and so on. So I'd like to spend the rest of the video showing you the code that allows that to happen. So let's get into that. We do have a single new variable, and that variable is called stack, $STACK. As you can see, we've set it to 3. There's a little note that says what it means. A single range band can hold up to $stack hovering enemies and up to $stack non-hovering enemies at the same time. And the changes that we've made are done in Setup Combat, I believe. So this is the page where we assign the initial values to the enemies, and one of those values is distance, and that value is stored in NME something 3. NME, of course, standing for enemy, and being the array that keeps track of a lot of the details about the enemies, just as $COM, short for companions, keeps track of similar details about the companions. So here's how we do it. We have this little note that says distance, and previously we just had a single line of code for distance, and that was just that we set their starting distance to 5. as you can see, now we've got quite a bit more code. So it's a fair bit more complicated, but really once I explain it, it is pretty straightforward. And we have these new temporary variables that we need to talk about as well. So let's start with them. We have Z2, which is the next place where we're going to put a hovering enemy, and it's set to 5 at the start. We have Y2, which is the same for non-hovering enemies, which is only the pupa versions, which don't turn up very often in the preset combats, but in the actual game, you might get sort of mixed groups of enemies where you have the pupas who start not hovering, and the adults, the males and the females, who start hovering. So yeah, Y2, that also starts at 5. That's the range band for the non-hovering enemies. Then we have Z3 is the number of hovering enemies that are already placed in the current range band. In this case, it starts at 0 because we haven't placed any yet, of course. And then Y3 is the equivalent for non-hovering enemies. So we have a for loop where we go from 1 to the number of types of enemies, essentially, and then we look in the $ENC_DET array, which is encountered underscore details, and we go through. One of the things that keeps track of is how many enemies of each type are in the combat, and we go through as many times as there are enemies, and we create a new enemy, essentially giving them all of their details, their type, whether they're flying or not, or hovering or not, their hit points, which are randomly rolled, and the distance. And so we have an if here, which is if enemy W, that's the current slot we're dealing with, if enemy W4 is equal to a capital Y, then we do all this, and then if not, we do all that. Because the limits are, there's like a limit of 3 for hovering enemies and a limit of 3 for non-hovering enemies. So we have to deal with them separately, depending on whether they count as a hovering or a non-hovering enemy. So we set enemy W3, the location, equal to Z2, which is the current range band that we're putting enemies in. Then we add 1 to Z3. Z3 is the number of hovering enemies that we've already put in that range band. And then we say, well, have we reached the stacking limit? Does Z3 equal $stack? And if it does, well, we don't want to place any more enemies in that. We don't want to place any more enemies of that type in that range band. So what we do is we set Z3 to 0, and then we reduce Z2 by 1. So we say, all right, we're going to start. We've filled up range band 5. Now we're going to subtract 1 from Z2, so that becomes 4. We're going to start placing things in range band 4, and we haven't placed anything in range band 4 yet, so we set Z3 to 0. And then, of course, we'll place, if we have more enemies to place of that type, we'll put another 3 in range band 4, and then Z3 will reach that stack, and then we'll reduce it again and go to range band 3, and so on. Because we're starting at range band 5, the maximum we can place is 15, so we're not ever going to sort of run into the problem of starting to hit the same place where the player characters are, because there's 5 range bands and they can have 3 enemies of a given type in each of them, and of course that means 15. So therefore, if we have the maximum number of enemies and they're all the same type, we still won't run out of space. So that is if enemy W4 is equal to a capital Y, meaning it's a hovering enemy. If it's a non-hovering enemy, it's exactly the same, except instead of Z3 and Z2, we're using Y3 and Y2. We set the value, we set their location to Y2, we increase Y3. If y3 is now equal to stack, we set it back to 0 and we reduce y2 by 1, indicating that we've run out of space for non-hovering enemies. So now we're going to move to the next range band forward and start placing them. And that is how we start with the enemies set up obeying that limit. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to keep obeying the limit, because of course the enemies move forward and back. And so we're going to need to put in a separate code which deals with when they want to move forward or back, stopping them doing so if that would violate the limit. We also have the problem that when an enemy is hovering and it is wounded, it goes from, when it's wounded for the first time, if it was hovering, it goes to non-hovering. And so that might mean that you had 3 non-hovering enemies. I mean, it's a bit of a corner case, but it is possible. You might have had 3 non-hovering enemies and 1 hovering enemy in a given range band. You wound the hovering enemy, and now you've got 4 non-hovering enemies. So we need to deal with that. The enemy is going to need to have to move somewhere to break to make sure that they obey that limit. But those are things that we'll be dealing with in videos to come. So for now, I hope that was useful or interesting to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.